Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Asia Society and to the Asia Society Policy Institute's program this morning on cementing the Quad in the Indo-Pacific region. I'm Rorry Daniels. I'm the Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, where we work towards Asia Society's mission of building mutual understanding and promoting collaboration between the countries of Asia and the United States by providing recommendations and roadmaps for tackling some of the region's largest policy challenges in everything from trade and economics, security and diplomacy, technology and society, and climate and energy. Many of these policy challenges are shared challenges, and addressing them adequately requires cooperation and collaboration among nations. At a time when large multinational institutions and multilateral institutions like the United Nations and the WTO seem unable to foster and sustain consensus, we're seeing the rise of more flexible mini-lateral groupings to address specific policy priorities. The Quad, which is the security and diplomacy group of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, seeks to advance a free, open, prosperous, and resilient Indo-Pacific, particularly as China's regional influence rises. To do so, it needs a region that's receptive to its mission, to its framing, and to its activities. So the report that we're launching today, Cementing the Quad in the Indo-Pacific, copies of which are on the table outside, is a culmination of a year of study on how the Quad is seen in the rest of the region, particularly South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. The report's co-authors, Farwa Aamer and Emma Chanlett Avery, conducted one-on-one expert consultations across these three key sub-regions. They held a virtual roundtable, a high-level convening in Tokyo, and held many meetings with officials in Washington, Tokyo, and other places to refine and test policy propositions and options. This panel will cover many of the useful insights and substantive recommendations for the Quad to enhance its regional presence and influence. But I'd like to, first and foremost, thank our partner in this effort, the Japan Foundation, for their generous support of this initiative. We're also indebted to the many experts who contributed their time and ideas to this research, particularly everyone who participated in the interviews and convenings, but especially our esteemed colleague on stage, Danny Russel, Asia Society Policy Institute non-resident distinguished fellow, who served in his previous role as vice president of the Policy Institute as project director and key advisor, and also our former colleague Blake Berger, who was instrumental in the project's creation. ASPI also benefits from having a presence in all four Quad countries, including an office in Delhi under the Asia Society's India Center, our office in Washington, D.C., where Emma is deputy director, and fellows at Asia Society Japan and Asia Society Australia. So we also want to thank our colleagues in Sydney, Tokyo, and Delhi for their involvement and support of our Quad-related work. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce your moderator today, Emma Chanlett Avery. Emma is the Director of Security and Political Affairs at ASPI, as well as Deputy Director of our Washington office. She has extensive experience in regional security issues and U.S. alliance relations in Asia, and comes to ASPI from the Congressional Research Service and a stint at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So at this point, if your cell phone ringer is on, please take a moment to silence it. I had written that into my remarks, and it came with perfect timing, so appreciate whoever needed to take that moment. And with that, please join me in welcoming our panel so they can get started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rorry, and thanks to all of you for coming to the launch of this report. I'm going to expand a little bit on Rorry's remarks and tell you how we approach this project. For the better part of the last year, Farwa and I, with a lot of guidance from Danny, have focused on the Quad, and particularly whether or not the Quad is the best vehicle for productive and sustained U.S. engagement in the region. So at the outset, we wanted to gather voices from Asia. So we wanted to see what the perceptions were, what were the risks of taking a different approach, where has the Quad disappointed or fallen short for our Asian partners. We cast a wide net going through Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Pacific Islands in a series of very early or very late Zoom conversations over the past year. and then brought a different set of partners together virtually again to further sort of solidify the impressions and sift through what we found. We then convened a private conference in Tokyo in person at the International House. And we were able to draw on a lot of experts that were resident in Tokyo, as well as have some experts fly in. So we had an Indonesian researcher, former ambassadors, former Japanese ambassadors to the region, some South Asian professors who worked in the space, private sector businessmen, and we basically workshopped through our initial impressions what were some policy options that could come out of our work so far. We then went and briefed very senior level officials in Tokyo about 2 weeks ahead of the Quad Foreign Ministers meeting and got a good response from them. Later, we traveled to Washington, D.C., or rather, they traveled to Washington, D.C. to join me, briefing State Department officials engaged in the Quad, and also had a robust series of meetings on the Hill as well. So this report outlines some of our key recommendations. I hope you will take a chance to read the larger report here. And basically, these recommendations are to fortify what we think could be one of the most viable platforms for U.S. engagement in the region. This panel here today will explore some of these themes and tease out some of these themes, as well as assess the path forward. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn to introduce our esteemed panelists here. First, we have Danny Russel, who we have lured back from his distinguished fellow position. You can run, but you can't hide, Danny. We're always going to come after you for your help. Farwa Aamer, who is the Director of South Asian Initiatives here at ASPI and my partner in crime for this project over the last several months. Ambassador Masafumi Ishii, who has been a real all-star in this project, coming to our Tokyo conference. We always value Ambassador Ishii's thoughtful perspective, particularly on Southeast Asia and the complexity of that region. And last, we have Nishank Motwani. He's from the other ASPI, first of all, so this is an olive branch, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Nishank was, I think I got this right, born in India, raised in Japan, educated in the United States, and calls Australia home. So he is the Quad. This is the Quad right here. And we really value his insight to this panel as well. So let's get started with the moderated conversation and hopefully have some time for some questions from you at the end. So Danny, you've been with us on this voyage of exploring the Quad. Where do we stand? What's the status of the Quad now? What are the possibilities of having this leader summit in India, given that we see a lot of tension in that relationship? Tell us your thoughts.
Thanks, Emma. And this has been a terrific project, so congratulations to both you and Farwa on your great work. I mean, I think it's clear that the Quad is in a rather fragile condition at the moment. It's in something of a lull or a slump after a few peaks of high expectations and activism. That having been said, generally speaking, the Quad is more of an institutionalized entity now than it certainly was 10 or 15 years ago, and frankly, even more so than it was when the Biden administration came in 2021. There are even though this may be a slump, there's a pretty dense fabric of meetings at multiple levels. There are the Quad Investor Network, QUIN, the AI Engage, Semiconductor Contingency Network, those sorts of things are significant and continue to exist and operate, albeit at a moderate level. The report makes the point that the unique feature and asset of the Quad is really its flexibility, and that is certainly the case. But of course, that flexibility is also something of a vulnerability. It's a two-edged sword. It's not an alliance. It doesn't have a kind of bureaucratic back office and driver. and its impact, therefore, really depends very much on leaders and the political will of the leaders, and particularly the political will of the American leader. And that's where it starts to get complicated. So, you know, as far as the question of whether there will be a Quad summit as long anticipated and if not promised in New Delhi in November, I've been able to identify three pretty clear answers. Yes, no, maybe. Yes, in that in their previous ministerial meeting, the four foreign ministers of the Quad signaled that they were working on, they reaffirmed their intent to hold the summit in November. The no comes from press reports of people in the senior circle around Trump saying clearly, on the record, albeit anonymously, that Trump had decided not to go, that he wasn't going, and this coincided with a spike in unhappiness, shall we say, between Donald Trump and Narendra Modi personally. And then recently, the ambassador nominee to represent the U.S. in India, Sebastian Gore, told a Senate panel that he thought probably Donald Trump would attend a summit. So who knows? I mean, some of this is just the mixed signals, the impulsive last-minute character that we see often in big decisions by President Trump. For all I know, it hinges on whether Modi nominates him for a Nobel Peace Prize or something. It may not just be a matter of scheduling or of geopolitics. It might also be that Donald Trump is moving slow on committing because his priority is trying to arrange a summit with China's Xi Jinping, and that he will first lock that down and then make a decision, potentially thinking that going forward, committing now to a Quad summit in the busy fall period might have a negative effect on his ability to get a yes from Xi Jinping. I think, defer to Farwa, but I think on the Indian side, it's pretty clear why they haven't confirmed the meeting, because the idea of holding a meeting that Donald Trump fails to show up at is politically, I think, not a risk that that Modi or the BJP wants to take. It has political and kind of optical consequences if that would happen. And obviously, if for whatever reason Donald Trump skipped the Quad leaders meeting, and I'm not at all convinced it would happen without him. I'm not sure that, you know, sending the vice president as a substitute, as has happened at East Asia Summit or elsewhere, would fly in Indian politics. That should that summit not occur, I think there are some pretty heavy costs, reputational costs, credibility costs. Unquestionably, I think it would be seen as convincing evidence of a retreat from the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, especially if Donald Trump-Xi Jinping meeting proceeded in its absence.
Thank you, Danny. And I think that's one of the big intrigues here is if Modi would hold the summit without him, and what does that mean in terms of the other legs holding together in this Quad? As you said, you defer to Farwa, and I always defer to Farwa, and you track U.S.-India relations quite closely. I'd love to have your take on where you think this stands, and whether or not I think it's fairly clear that Modi's not going to nominate him for a Nobel Peace Prize, given some of the fallout. But welcome your thoughts on this and how it relates to the summit.
Thank you, Emma, and of course I echo Rory's and Danny's thanks to the project team, of course, working with Emma on this project, quite a few learnings to the Japan Foundation and all the experts that we've spoken to in the process. It's very interesting. When we had started this project and when we started our initial conversations, we were looking at a US-India relationship that was remarkably resilient, had bipartisan support in Washington, D.C. in terms of what the US foreign policy will look like for India. It's going to be the most comprehensive strategic partnership. It's going to be one that the Washington would like to keep close. And there was an early embrace of the Quad. The foreign ministers were all there. Prime Minister Modi was one of the first leaders to secure a meeting with President Trump, and there was big fanfare around it. Particularly on trade, there was a Mission 500 goal announced to reach $500 billion trade by 2030. So there was all of this ambition, and India was one of the first countries to actually proactively launch trade negotiations with the United States. They saw it coming. That was very pragmatic of them because President Trump, even before he joined office, had kind of called out India for its high tariffs. Now, in the past 6 months, that dynamic has shifted, and more recently, in the last few weeks, the United States and India, it's going through a period of a test, which is of course, testing the resilience of its partnership, but it's brought out some very hard rhetoric from Washington, which has hurt sentiments in New Delhi. There's disappointment, but again, what we have seen is regardless of what's being discussed and what the punitive measures have been with regards to India's continued imports on Russian oil, the inability to reach the trade deal and the reciprocal adjusted tariff of 25%, which is much higher than some of its South Asian peers that was imposed on August 7, and the combined tariff rate at 50% of Indian imported goods to the United States. It's a pretty heavy pushback from Washington in terms of its relationship and where they were at with India. And of course, the May conflict between India and Pakistan and some of the friction that arose from that and the unease of the United States re-engaging with Pakistan post that, and President Trump championing the US involvement in the ceasefire and mediating the ceasefire, which one side being Pakistan, embracing, nominating the president for his decisive action and diplomatic intervention in sort of securing peace and nominating him for the Nobel Peace Prize, and India publicly sort of dismissing that claim. All of these have kind of fed into the trust deficit that we've seen come up and the trade talks being stalled. So now with all of that, that's testing the relationship. I remain optimistic that given that New Delhi has not gone full retaliation, despite the political pressure that Prime Minister Modi is experiencing on the ground, they also stand strong on the trade side where there are red lines and they can't go beyond what certain limitations are in the dairy and the agricultural sector to protect their own farmers. And Prime Minister Modi said so himself that I know there'll be a personal price to pay, but I'll do whatever to protect our farmers, our fishermen. But the US has greater demands of New Delhi. So as we speak, the trade talks have resumed. I understand that they're not the round that we were hoping to see in August, but the talks are happening. So the momentum's kind of restoring, but really the main question is, I agree with everything that Danny said, there's the moment of fragility in the US-India relationship, and it's reflective of what will happen to the Quad summit in New Delhi. When the G20 had happened, it was a big celebration for New Delhi, when the leaders had flown in. The Quad summit would have been that. When we started the project, we continuously were sort of pegging our work also to knowing that there'll be a trade pact that will happen, it'll be announced during the Quad summit, and it'll be a win-win, and that would be Prime Minister Modi and President Trump sort of re-engaging after the February summit. It will and it will be an opportunity. The president will go to Delhi to meet Prime Minister Modi primarily, and the Quad summit will be a plus. But now all of that kind of hangs in balance. So really the question is, by November, what happens to the trade negotiations? Do we have a trade pact? Is the Modi-Trump camaraderie, given that the two leaders haven't spoken ill against each other publicly at all, could save the day? Could there be an opportunity for sort of some resolution on the Russia side, which doesn't seem to be the case. So time's running short. So again, I agree with what Danny said. If the summit does not take place, there's reputational damage to the Quad credibility, because in what happened during the Biden administration is that the leader level meeting, the 4 leaders coming together from each country, added a lot of political weight. And it was a clear signal to all the regions that the Quad is here to stay. We're here to provide public goods. We're here to be sort of the flag bearer of a free and open Indo-Pacific and a rule-based order. So that symbolism will get tarnished if one of the leaders is missing. And so if the 3 leaders do decide to convene, which is the most unlikely scenario, then you'll have a very watered down statement and leave a lot to be desired. Again, the credibility of the United States president being in the chair at the Quad Summit is extremely important, but there is significant commitment that at least we've heard from the Secretary of State towards it. So I think all eyes on how the Secretary of State takes this forward if he meets his foreign minister counterparts during the UNGA sidelines.
Great, thank you for that, Farwa. I want to shift gears a little bit now. One of the key takeaways, which would be obvious to anyone following this, is that the region very much doesn't want to be drawn into the U.S.-China competition. It doesn't want to be asked to choose sides. So Ambassador Ishii, first of all, thank you so much for coming all the way from Japan to join this panel. We really appreciate that. What do you think would be the risks if the United States does engage in the Quad but takes a decidedly anti-Beijing framing, which indeed in the first Trump administration, Secretary of State Pompeo did just that? Love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Emma, and it's always great to get out of a humid and very hot Tokyo. So I guess keyword in describing the present situation in the region is vacuum created by the United States. Whatever is actually the intention of the US government, you are seen by the regional partners that you are leaving. You have no interest in Asia. So which means if you are gone, obvious alternative is China. China is coming in. Most of the countries don't want a situation where they are dominated by China only. So they need you for balancing act. So I think everybody wants the United States to come back, whether that means anti-Chinese attitude or not. It's better than the vacuum. So I think, and then Quad has been working as an anchor to make sure that the US stay engaged in the region. So I think, I hope President Trump shows up in New Delhi for the summit meeting. But even if he doesn't, I think Quad itself remains very important vehicle to show the foundation of stability in balancing the Chinese influence in the region, which means we are going to have meetings, even without Trump, which I don't like to see, but that's better than vacuum, I think.
Actually, I want to tease out one of the things you said. One of the sort of bumper sticker takeaways here was that used to be the Quad was all about keeping India in and on sides, and now it's about keeping the United States in. That's really the direction we've gone. Nishank, thank you for coming all the way from Washington, D.C. On my train. And I wanted to get your take on this too. What would be the impact if the United States, more was seen as more as encircling Beijing? I wonder if you agree with Ambassador Ishii that even if there's some anti-China rhetoric, it's better than being absent. And what do you think it takes to get regional buy-in to Quad initiatives?
Thank you, Emma, and thank you to Asia Society for having me here. I was engaging with you guys in DC, so it's lovely to see your project and the report come out. I think to that question of, I think China's been able to position or is positioning itself as the more responsible actor. It is articulating the fact that it is there to stay. It's got the geography to prove it. It's got deep economic linkages with ASEAN and several other countries in the region, and for many of them, it is the largest trading partner. It has been rather successful in carrying out a sophisticated mis and disinformation campaign to demonstrate that the region benefits better if China takes the lead. So how does that affect if the United States were to come back? I think there's 4 areas that I'm particularly looking at. One is that it takes on the issue of trust. Why trust the United States is the rhetoric that's coming out of Beijing when we are here to stay. The United States is militarizing the Indo-Pacific. AUKUS comes up as in conversations as well. We can get to that in a bit. But it likes to point out why would you want to go trust the United States when it is using its position to punish and take punitive action against its allies and partners, whether through tariffs and other measures. The second issue is about if the United States were to come back and, let's say, rejoin the Quad or to anchor itself more decisively in the Indo-Pacific, is that it also plays into the hands of China's rhetoric of the Quad decisively being anti-China. I think that's a position that the Quad has always faced, so it's nothing new. But what it does is that it makes it more strident, especially with symbolic renaming of departments from the Department of Defense to the Department of War now. So it gives it that greater oxygen as a way to make it seem like it's more anti-China. The third is that with the U.S., if it were to come back in, and this is what countries also want, they want options. But the way that flipping the script again is with China saying that more economic interdependence with the United States means that the U.S. can use those relations for greater leverage, and it can become potentially more coercive. We've seen the U.S. Impose tariffs on practically every country, and the counter argument that China is presenting is that we don't want to do that. We're not doing that. We're a more stabilizing factor and actor than the United States. So why would you want the United States back in the region? Work with us. Which leads me to the fourth point, which is that unlike the United States, China prioritizes, this is according to their rhetoric, unlike the United States, China prioritizes your local concerns. They want to showcase that they're more development oriented. They can deploy capital, especially state-run or private capital. They can get the job done very quickly through bringing in their own engineers, building partners, and so on. But that comes at the cost of, obviously, there's no free lunch. So what's being diluted? What's being diluted is your sovereignty. What's being diluted is the fact that there's greater Chinese interference in domestic affairs. We've seen this carry out in Australia. In Canberra, there was recently an arrest of an Australian citizen who was, is currently under investigation for having collaborated with China under our own foreign interference laws, and also that economic interdependence becomes weaponized. I was at the hearing at the special hearing that was convened where our former Prime Minister Scott Morrison spoke along with former Ambassador Rahm Emanuel on China's coercive activities in the Indo-Pacific. And what became really clear was that the way in which that economic interdependence becomes weaponized over time, and it becomes really difficult to extract then. So the biggest challenge, which is again not a new one, but has become more strident, is the narrative issue of with the U.S. coming back into the Quad, if that happens. I mean, it hasn't left yet, but yeah. But if the summit were to take place, is that it would give Beijing more ammunition, but that I would argue that can be managed, and we're probably going to cover that.
Great, thank you. As Danny mentioned initially, the Quad is very much leader-driven, and it thrives when all of the leaders sort of align strategically. And I want to push a little bit to see, Danny, whether you think that the Quad has the institutional heft that you mentioned to survive when they're not as aligned, and put another way, sort of how do the U.S. relations with the other Quad members impact the success of the Quad?
Well, it depends in part on how you define the success of the Quad, and the fundamental divide is whether the raison d'etre of the Quad is a bulwark against China, Chinese expansionism, Chinese hegemony, Chinese coercion, or whether the Quad is a platform for providing global goods, addressing regional problems, offering alternatives to China's global governance initiative and global civilization initiatives and global development initiatives and so on. So I think that clearly is going to be an issue. I think, secondly, the big variable is how the U.S.-China relationship and the Trump-Xi Jinping relationship unfolds essentially in this calendar year. And President Trump announced, although he's announced phone calls with Xi Jinping many, many times this year that didn't pan out. This time it's going to happen, and I can testify to that based on what I just heard in Beijing last week during a visit. There will be a phone call. There's been a spate of cabinet level contacts, meeting in Madrid between the trade team that at least seems to have come up with some vague framework and some way forward on TikTok, the issue of our century apparently. But I think that keeping our eye on that big variable of the U.S.-China relationship, because if there is a, shall we say, U-turn in the Trump administration's approach to China, and we've already seen hawks turn into doves and be remanded to their cages. There are things that we haven't seen that one would have expected to see coming out of the bureaucracy that strongly imply that there's a political break being tapped in Washington to prevent actions that would queer a deal that may be in the works with the Chinese. But should that happen, I think that particularly Australia and Japan would feel like the rug was pulled out from under them, and from the Quad. It would be hugely complicated, I think, and it would exacerbate the kind of skepticisms about U.S. consistency, reliability that Ambassador Ishii alluded to. It also weakens the strategic rationale for pursuing the Quad, in Washington at least, and among the partners and more broadly in the region. I think it contributes to the feel of an American retreat, to the vacuum syndrome that Ambassador Ishii mentioned. So I think it is hard to see significant progress or a significant softening of the strategic rivalry between Washington and Beijing doing anything good for the long-term effectiveness or coherence of the Quad. And it probably would reinforce the regional narrative that the Quad was really just an American tool for the strategic rivalry, and now it's being set aside. I will say, though, that I mean, there is a silver lining in the sense that I don't believe that the other Quad governments were ever all that comfortable with the Quad as a blunt instrument to bludgeon China into submission. And so a coalition that's not perceived as being fundamentally anti-China is a coalition that they may be more comfortable with. And so if Washington were to handle a shift in relations with Beijing in a reasonably deft way, one could imagine that leading to renewal of cooperation and coordination on providing the kinds of services and benefits, programs to the region that countries in the region, whether it's Southeast Asia, South Asia, or the Pacific, really want. But I think quite apart from the risks of a Trump-Xi deal that raises some of these concerns is the prospect of a deal that takes place without any kind of coordination, that comes as a surprise. I think both Quad partners and countries in the region can certainly accept the U.S. being pragmatic in dealing with China, but I don't think they can accept being blindsided.
Thanks for that. Ambassador Ishii, one of the things that we learned in all these consultations was that overwhelmingly everyone thought that Japan was the most trusted, reliable partner in the region. They come in, they do their project, they clean up, they're polite. I wonder particularly if the U.S. recedes somewhat from leadership. Is Japan positioned to step up to that role? And since we have you here, I wish you'd comment a little bit on whether or not Ishiba resigning, the new leaders coming in will have the same agenda when it comes to the Quad, and even if they have a pretty much identical agenda, is the revolving door of short-lived prime ministers detrimental to getting this framework going more robustly?
Well, obviously, we are entering once again into the era of political instability. Although I think after the announcement of resignation by Ishiba, things got clearer because the election is going to take place within a month, 4th of October, and the new president of LDP will be elected, who will then become a prime minister. And I think whoever becomes a prime minister succeeding Ishiba will follow the basic policy relating to the Quad. Quad is a very important, most important platform for us in putting our resources together to realize the stability and prosperity in the region. And your point about Japan assuming more responsibility, I think at least I'm convinced that we should. And then we feel pretty strong request coming from particularly Southeast Asian countries. As I said, vacuum is there. And then I don't think China is neither ready or able to fill the vacuum because they haven't presented alternative narrative. They stay engaged and they are stable, yeah, but they haven't got involved in the solution of the regional conflicts like Myanmar, Cambodia, the Thailand. So I think they are not ready to assume the responsibility in a way the United States has been doing in the past. So I think there is definitely still a vacuum. And then I think all the Southeast Asian countries are running around to hedge their relation. And then some of them even went as far as to Russia, participating in a military parade in May. Vietnam was there, and then I think Indonesian president was in Russia instead of attending the G7 hosted by Canada. So I think for them, the most reliable and easiest choice for hedging is Japan. And that message has been delivered to Tokyo many times, very clearly in the past few months. So whoever, well, our prime minister is now getting short-lived, but I think whoever is the prime minister, I think we as a country has to fill the gap because it's, after all, it's in a backyard. And then we need the stability and prosperity of the region in the backyard. So we are determined to fill the gap before until US comes back. So I think the shortest answer to your question is yes, we have to do it.
I'm sure part of this a good reputation has to do with your very effective ambassadorship to Indonesia. That's a lot of the reason that Japan is seen that way. So if the Quad enters sort of a period of drift, I want to ask Nishank and Farwa, what are the alternatives for the countries of South Asia and Southeast Asia, Pacific Islands? Is that more cooperation with China? Is it affiliation with the organization like the BRICS, which we heard about sometimes? What are the other alternatives for them if we do see the framework fade a bit? Farwa.
Okay. So speaking for South Asia, if the Quad enters a period of drift, South Asia, and I can say this because I'm from South Asia, it has a number of issues of its own. There's a lot going on domestically, and it has got a lot to sort out. And they've been existent for a very long time. But primarily, it has to do with political instability and economic instability. For a very long time, it has been adopting hedging strategies where it has been trying to partner from a security perspective with the United States and from an economic perspective, being dependent on China, whether it's the smaller states, whether it's Pakistan, they are all very close to China, both economically and from a strategic perspective as well. Now, there is an India element to South Asia, of course, the only Quad member that exists within South Asia, and there is a particular lens that Quad is viewed from within the region. That's the India lens, right? So now there's a lot of change that the region is going through, not only in terms of political transitions that we've seen in the past few years, Bangladesh notably, Nepal more recently, and we've seen a greater engagement with China happen. Bangladesh, the chief advisor, Yunus, he's been engaging with China. There's been a lot of exchange in terms both economically and people to people between the two countries. He's also been pushing for the ASEAN membership. So there's a call for a greater relationship with the Southeast Asian countries. Nepal has, prior to the upheaval that happened last week, was kicking off the BRI cooperation in full swing after the former prime minister was in Beijing last year. Pakistan, of course, has CPEC, which is the flagship project of the BRI. So with all of that, China was always going to be there, and it's going to be there regardless. But if the Quad, and the Quad's weight, again, was what can the Quad provide in terms of public goods? What can it provide in terms of the HADR? What can it provide in terms of the climate resilience efforts for the region and to help with some of the technology standards? Again, so it will not be that the region will swiftly move into the in the China basket because it does value its relationship with Japan, with as you mentioned, Ambassador Ishii, as Southeast Asia does. It sees a reliable partner, development partner in Japan. The chief advisor, Yunus, was in Japan. The Pakistani Prime Minister is going to be in Japan for the first time in many years in October. So there's a lot of relationship building happening. So they're trying to diversify their basket, and it's got a lot to do with how they are hedging in terms of what they're seeing coming out of Washington and how the Washington's foreign policy keeps shifting and the news cycle remains relentless. And less to do with what's happening with the Quad. But if the Quad was to engage, this is the opportunity where it kind of, seeks the momentum, and even if the United States becomes, sort of cedes influence and takes a back seat, it's Japan, India, and Australia that can step in and sort of hold the fort and keep the machinery running on cooperation to ensure that China doesn't come and engulf the region fully.
Nishank, particularly if you have thoughts on Southeast Asia, and there are other alternatives outside of the Quad.
I'll talk about two, Southeast Asia and Pacific Island
Obviously,
countries.
Southeast Asia is
Broader,
quite broad. Yeah.
Broader, but I'll combine them in one. I would argue I'm not entirely sure whether the Quad is the best format for engagement going forward, especially if there's tension amongst the, at least with the U.S. and all the other three relations as a result suffer. Take Japan, for instance. Japan has been hosting the PALM Summit, the Pacific Islands Leadership Meeting, since 1997, if I'm not mistaken. And that represents a grouping of 18 different countries that it has brought together every single year, so much before, and it gives it the credibility of holding the summit before security concerns about China really started to get entrenched. So Japan has that ability to reach out and on its own terms with Pacific Island countries, and its own institutions such as JBIC, JICA play a really important role in developmental assistance, as well as taking Japanese companies to the region for their own economic security purposes. I think one of the key facets of Japan's approach to the Pacific Island countries is to really understand and listen to local concerns and what they really care about. And climate change is an existential threat to them. And Japan is one of the key players in the region, alongside Australia, which also plays a very significant role, and of course, across the ditch, as we would say, New Zealand as well. All these countries play a significant role in reaching out to Pacific Island countries, and of course, in ASEAN too, to provide alternatives to China. So, to my earlier point, if the Quad is in a moment of drift, let it drift, rather than, I'm not saying it should continue drifting, but there are other formats that should be prioritized, because otherwise, if the political, economic, diplomatic weight falls on one country, Japan primarily, to do that bidding, there are going to be trade-offs with its other engagements, whether through PALM and so on. The second area around which there can be greater momentum, and we've already seen that, is through because the state of relation is through the bilateral relations. So Japan-Australia relations, India-Australia, and India-Japan relations. So the bilateral relations across the Quad members are quite robust. I'll take Australia as a case in point. Recently, at least in the field of defense, there have been some significant developments that have taken place, which will have economic benefits as well as the ability to provide public goods. Australia last month awarded Japan the contract to purchase future frigates for its navy. That is significant for a variety of reasons. Number one, it resolves Japan's issue of having, the Japanese defense companies to have only one customer, which is the Japanese Self-Defense Force. It allows for that technology transfer and building of those vessels in Australia. And that's huge when it comes to bringing the two Indo-Pacific allies closer to one another. One is a northern security anchor, Australia being the southern security anchor. And this is something that the US has been wanting the allies to do, which is to play a bigger role in Indo-Pacific security affairs. So that's one. Second is the AUKUS agreement. I won't get into the details, but AUKUS Pillar 2, when it was first launched, the AUKUS agreement, when it was first announced 4 years ago, there was a lot of reticence and resistance about whether any other country should be part of AUKUS. There was a lot of commentary whether AUKUS should become JAUKUS, but what's changed over the last 4 years is there's been a growing recognition and acceptance by Australia that we need to have other industrial powerhouses that have the technological capabilities to play specific roles around technological verticals in AUKUS Pillar 2. So there could be areas around which that cooperation takes place, which will further bring in Japan and Australia closer together. So those are other formats of cooperation that are taking place. And I personally, it would be great to have the Quad working as it was before, but but at the moment it's a drift. Okay, how about we concentrate our efforts on the other things that are actually going well?
Emma, just very quickly, because you had mentioned BRICS, to add, Indonesia joined BRICS. It's now an expanded grouping. It's really about whether these countries would go into, we just saw some fun photos from the SCO summit, and there was a lot of chatter around, India-China ties. Of course, that has to be read with caution. There's an effort to stabilize that's been going on well before any of the shifts in the US foreign policy towards India had happened. But whether BRICS will get stronger and invite more membership from some of these South Asian nations as they see Quad as sort of less dependent, or the United States as sort of less dependent of a partner, dependable of a partner, that could happen. But I think there's also a concern with what kind of retaliatory measures would come their way if they would overtly come and support the BRICS. The BRICS has been a target of the president, saying that 100% tariffs on any country that aligns itself with the BRICS and the anti-Western policies of the BRICS. So that is, again, a play of caution there, but it's also how these countries, again, the Quad is a piece of this puzzle, is watching this global order shift. And it will, again, a lot will depend on what comes out of the US-China engagement. Is the global order shifting? Is the multipolar world here to stay? All of those questions that are simmering, how are these countries and their foreign policies evaluating those?
Great. I also really like across the ditch. I'm definitely going to use that with my Kiwi friends. I've never heard that before. Since we like to end on a bit of a high note, what are the areas that are the most ripe for Quad initiatives? Are there commercial opportunities that could be pursued through the Quad, incentives that Quad governments could offer, public-private partnerships? Danny, do you have any thoughts on some of the ways that, critical mineral cooperation that we heard about at the State Department? Which are the areas that you think might actually, appeal to the United States, particularly, to be more involved?
Well, where I would start, and this may be slightly counterintuitive, is with risk. When you're in business, risk and lack of predictability are the enemy. These are very serious problems. So before you even get to the doors that you want to open for progress, to the extent that the Quad and the Quad countries, by cooperating through their various programs, can help reduce risk, can introduce some measure of predictability and confidence into the broader economic environment, they will be making a really big contribution. In terms of beyond that, and that's a pretty tall order. We're not, unfortunately, clearly heading in that direction. I think I would say technology is the biggest area of opportunity, the biggest, shall we say, force multiplier in a way. And we've already seen supply chain initiatives on semiconductors, AI Engage, as I mentioned, critical minerals, quantum, 5G diversification, those sorts of areas. It's a place where the appetite among the smaller countries in the three subregions is matched by the technological capabilities, what the four countries really have to offer, which is very considerable. So that's, I think, very smart and reasonably self-evident. Within that is the question of artificial intelligence and how AI can be can be deployed, what sort of AI-related training, specifically standards, safety. I mean, the areas in which there's a crying need for some kind of organizing principle, and where the high degree, or relatively high degree of faith and trust that most countries have in Japan, in the United States, in Australia, and India is a significant net plus. Obviously, infrastructure and digital connectivity is what the region is crying for, what it needs. I think the Quad countries have individually and collectively experimented with ways to sort of offer alternatives, meet the BRI challenge, etc. It's proven to be excruciatingly difficult, but there's much more that the Quad countries can do to rationalize their respective programs to reduce friction among themselves, increase complementarity, and so on. So the Quad countries, even collectively, are not going to outspend or outcompete the Belt and Road Initiative, China per se, but they have many tools at their disposal, beginning with sort of de-risking, and I think they can use public public-private partnerships, as you mentioned, as a way of creating commercially viable pathways and alternatives. And my read is that it's a little misleading to characterize the attitudes of countries in the subregions as simply being confronted with a choice between China or the West. They are conducting arbitrage. I mean, you can call it hedging, but they are all in pursuit of a high degree of autonomy. And they want to ensure that they are able to stand up and defend their own interests in the face of either Chinese pressure or the U.S. pressure. And if, in fact, the Quad is clearly moribund, which is almost synonymous with the U.S. having retreated, their ability to defend their own interests in the face of Chinese pressure is radically diminished.
Thank you. We are short on time, but I think I'll turn to the audience for one or two questions and offer it up to the panelists to answer. Sir, right there, I saw your hand first.
There were many positions expressed finally in this discussion, but I believe that Danny indicated that the report itself was moderate in its conclusions. I wonder if there were any significant voices among the reporters as to whether the report should have taken other than the moderate tone that apparently it did take.
Okay. Let's do a question here too. We'll just put a
your point about risk and predictability, the possibility of changing the currency in the world, the United States, is that something that what the BRICS is indicating? Is that, in your opinion, going to happen?
And let's do one more question, and panelists can offer what they would like to. Right there, sir.
You talked about the withdrawal, if you will, of the United States and leaving it to more of a triangle with Japan taking a sort of possible lead role. However, what's the risk of India withdrawing from it and now leaving it just basically Japan and Australia? And if so, then where does the, quote, Quad exist from that particular point?
Yeah, new geometry. Farwa, do you want to take on any of those questions, or?
Just to quickly respond to the last one. If India withdraws, India has always been seen as the player on. Oh, the player. Thank you. I thought one would think I'll have it by now, but no. It's always been seen as the player that's been on the fence and within the Quad. It has a large disputed border with China. Any sort of hard security posture coming out of the grouping would not help India's case. India has its own sort of issue sets that it needs to resolve, and now particularly it wants to stabilize relations with China because it wants to focus on other foreign policy and domestic priorities, rightfully so. China wants to do the same. So in terms of, we talked about this formulation earlier that we came up with during our project, was that it was all about keeping India in dialogue within the Asia Pacific. That was Quad's sort of mission to begin with. Now it's about keeping the US in. I do think that, again, I do feel there is optimism and hope for the US and their relationship to bounce back. Maybe not overnight, but it will. And India will see value in keeping engaged within the Quad because it helps the dialogue with the United States, whether at the working level or at the leadership level, continued and ongoing, as well as with other partners in the Indo-Pacific that it values. If it doesn't happen and India also kind of drifts away, then it'll have to go to partners like France and others because the Indian Ocean region is meaningful. It's right in the backyard of India. So the Indo-Pacific has direct implications for India, so any harm that happens there. So I do see India keeping its position in the Quad relevant and ongoing. Danny?
I wouldn't confuse the sort of moderate tone of the report with suggestion that we have diluted any of the conclusions or the feedback that we receive. I think one point, a very important point that, among others, that the report makes is the differentiation between the demand signals from the different sub-regions. There are overlaps, but there are distinct differences in what, generally speaking, our interlocutors from the Pacific Islands, from Southeast Asia, and from South Asia really prioritized in terms of what they're looking for from the Quad collectively, or for that matter, from the four countries themselves. And this report takes place against a great deal of uncertainty about the political climate and relationships, which are quite dynamic, as we've discussed. But that's an area, I think, the sort of bespoke needs and priorities of the sub-regions that is worthy of further work and further showcasing. In terms of currency, I'm not an expert, but at all. That doesn't stop me, of course. And I've sat in on a lot of conversations by people with great expertise on currency, on financial transactions, on digital currencies, etc. I don't entirely pretend to understand it. What I would say is that the prospect of a BRICS bank and a competing international settlement system, or a competing alternative currency seems to be still reasonably distant. The barriers to a full-fledged alternative emerging to the US dollar and to the SWIFT system still are pretty formidable, but my intuition is that Western policymakers ignore that risk at their peril, that there is inevitably a risk, and there are a number of contributing features that could make that risk more imminent, including flawed domestic fiscal practices and policies. That said, what I think is happening is that countries like Russia, China, and others are looking for alternate mechanisms for settling transactions among them that avoid the dollar and the SWIFT system and lower their vulnerability to U.S. sanctions or U.S. Interference. That's not the same as creating an alternative global financial system. It's really about protecting themselves. And it can be as primitive as straight up barter arrangements, such as we're seeing between Russia and North Korea in the arms trade and so on. So there's plenty to worry about. My view is we should analyze and address the specific behaviors that constitute problems and threats, rather than approach it as an abstract question of global finance.
Ambassador Ishii, anything to add to those last round of questions?
Okay, two quick points. First point relates to the moderate result of the report. I think Quad is a leadership-driven kind of meeting, but it's also famous for its functional cooperation, make things happen, infrastructure cooperation, maritime domain awareness, supply chain resilience, critical mineral supply, and so on and so forth. So I think it's very important for Quad to keep producing result. And I think Quad has a lot of potential for that. You need to realize that Belt and Road Initiative is not on the rise. The money China is using for the BRI is sharply declining. So there is a lot of financial needs in relation to the infrastructure building in the region. You know, all the development assistance has become very unpopular, particularly here. USAID is gone, but still, I think this is once again a vacuum issue. A lot of financial resources are needed for infrastructure building. There's still huge demand for infrastructure. So that's where I think Quad can make things happen, even without the presence of the United States. I think if we are with the United States, we could do a better job. But even if the United States is gone, I think Japan, India, Australia, I think can deliver some part of it, because there is a vacuum not created not only by the United States, but also by the kind of withdrawal of the Chinese money from the, out of the market. Second point is about India's interest. I think, well, if it becomes clear that the US is gone forever from a Quad, I think not me personally, but Japan would go for inclusion of other important players in the region by creating Asian Quad, Japan, Australia, India, Indonesia. I think there are a lot of reasons for us to engage Indonesia, because Indonesia has now gone to BRICS side. So India has been in BRICS as well as in the Quad. So we need to somehow balance the presence of the Indonesia, because Indonesia is going to become a very, very important country in the region. So I think if we, and from that viewpoint, India, Indonesia, and Australia has created trilateral already. So that keeps Indian interest going, because they are after all neighbors. So I think, and by the way, India's GDP will overtake Japan's this year, and Indonesia's GDP will overtake Japan's sometime in mid-2040s. So I think we have every reason to keep Indonesia and India both on our side. So the best way to do it is to create, by creating an Asian Quad. Of course, it's better to have the United States, but if US is gone, somebody has to fill the gap.
You heard it here first, right? Nishank.
Thank you very much. Just to build on Ambassador Ishii's point, keeping it, keeping it in the region, as he said, of course, it'll be great if the US is there, but we can find other partners. Indonesia, South Korea, we've heard, Squad is another acronym that gets used. But there's also the possibility of other ASEAN countries, including PNG. So PNG celebrated its 50th independence anniversary yesterday, and on during that celebration, Prime Minister Albanese was there, Defense Minister Richard Marles, and there's been reporting that has been coming out leading up to this particular 50th anniversary was that there could be a very significant mutual defense treaty that would be signed between Australia and PNG, which would have three elements. One, mutual defense treaty. Second, total integration, not interoperability, but integration of PNG defense forces with Australia and vice versa. And third, meaning that they would be engaging in greater maritime security operations. So to the point of what could the Quad be doing, with or without the United States in the Indo-Pacific, is particularly coming together, the Coast Guards of the Quad coming together to enforce maritime law, because one of the core defining principles of the Quad is a free and open Indo-Pacific rules-based order. Well, part of that comes from maritime law and enforcing it. So the Quad, as at least the three navies or the three coast guards of the Quad, Australia would need to build one. We have the ABF. We don't quite have a coast guard yet. There's a significant amount of opportunities there for the three countries, along with other partners in the Indo-Pacific, to cooperate when it comes to the Coast Guard. Second, very quickly, is mobilizing private capital or government-backed capital to counter BRI investments. And we've already seen this happen. A prominent example being where Japan, Australia, and the US came together to outbid the Chinese taking over Digicel, the largest mobile network provider in the Pacific, and the three countries came together to outbid them, ensuring that the telecom provider, the largest telecom provider in the Pacific, remain in the hands of the three countries as opposed, well, it remained in the hands of democratic countries as opposed to it being sold off to a Chinese-backed consortium. So I think those are creative areas around which there can be interventions to counter the BRI investments.
And very quickly on this maritime law point, and in addressing the question about the report being moderate, if you dig deeply enough in the report, we actually have some sort of bold recommendations, one of them being building support for ratifying the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I mean, that was met with a loud round of scoffs, I think, when we had our Hill meetings. But we are at least putting that forward because that would be incredibly important in terms of the credibility of the United States and of the Quad and throwing their weight behind that. So it turns out that an hour was way too short a period of time to get to all that we wanted to address, but please pick up a copy of the report. Please join me in thanking the Japan Foundation for their support and the panelists for this discussion.